Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This episode is about Albert Ellis and his psychological system of rational emotive behavior therapy. I'm going to look at its strengths and its weaknesses. Few people in the realm of change work have influenced me more than Albert Ellis, and I truly believe, based upon my own personal experiences and based upon my experiences of seeing clients professionally for the last 23 years, that we would all be better off if people who do change work, therapy, and coaching had an in-depth understanding of Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy. So let's dive into this a little bit. I think that Ellis is one of the most important figures in psychology and in the world of change work and self-help. I think he, to a large extent, helped during the 50s or starting in the 50s bring psychology out of a dark age. So at that time, Freudian psychoanalysis and behaviorism, people like Skinner were dominating the game. And Ellis, in around 1953-ish, started to change things. And the interesting thing about Ellis was that he had been practicing psychoanalysis for a few years and was frustrated with just how inefficient psychoanalysis was. And Ellis was a very intelligent man. He was a student of philosophy, and he looked back to his own time as a young adult. So when Ellis was a young adult, he was terrified of women, or specifically approaching women and showing interest. So what he did was that he forced himself, he sat on a park bench in New York every day during the summer, and he forced himself to talk to any woman who approached. And this was hell for him. On the first day, he even puked. But after having done at least 100 of these encounters, he completely got over his fear. Now, he was also a young radical, a revolutionary who wised up in his later years. But he realized the necessity of being able to speak in public, and he was terrified of this as well. So he used the same method. He just essentially forced himself to do as many public speeches as he could. And the exact same thing happened as with the fear of approaching women. He got over his fear completely by doing what people would call exposure or exposure therapy, although I think that the term therapy is completely inappropriate. It dawned on him as a psychoanalyst that psychoanalysis was very often extremely ineffective, and that he had overcome his own fears not by doing psychoanalysis, but by exposing himself to what he seemed to fear. He was also, as I said, a student of philosophy and had spent a lot of time studying the great Greek and Roman philosophers, and started to apply that with his clients. So what Ellis, during a period where people were obsessed with childhood and unconscious conflicts and old Freudian psychoanalytic theories, Ellis rescued the field from the Dark Ages by bringing in the thinking of people like old Greek philosophers like Epictetus, who say, and this is a quote, "We are disturbed not by what happens to us, but by our thoughts about what happens." Ellis had a very simple model, which he called the ABC model, where A stood for an activating event. So someone says something, for example, or does something. B stands for beliefs, your interpretations, your story about what it means. And C stands for consequences, what you feel, how you behave, what you do. Most people are obsessed with A, the activating events, and C, the consequences. Ellis was the first psychologist, not the first. Milton Erickson was probably the first in many ways, but he was the first well-known one at the time who started to write books and to lecture widely, who brought attention back to B in the spirit of Epictetus and other Greek and Roman philosophers, in terms of how are you making meaning of this? How are you making sense of this? What story are you creating about what this means? And instead of focusing on his client's childhood and so-called unconscious conflicts, he would completely discard that more or less and focus on the client's meaning making and internal dialogue and sense making in this very moment, and develop techniques to help people think more rationally. And that worked to a very large extent. So if you think about it rationally, we have relatively little influence often over life's A's, life's activating events. C, it's often hard to directly change a feeling, but we have a lot more choice and influence when it comes to B, meaning our stories about things, how we interpret, how we make meaning. So you get a lot more bang for the buck, so to speak, by orienting your clients there. So at the time, when most therapists were either focused on conditioning, as in behaviorism, or a client's past, Ellis did something great. Now, it should be said that there was another guy, Arenbeck, who originated CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, who also got his start in the mid-50s, independently of Ellis. So this was kind of amusing that you had two guys, Arenbeck and Albert Ellis, with CBT and REBT, although it was called RET to begin with, completely independently of each other, allegedly, who started to work in a very similar direction. A lot of what I'm going to be saying here applies to CBT as well, although I have to say that I prefer REBT over CBT for reasons that will become apparent as we move along. So focusing people's attention on B was a very important step in psychotherapy and psychology at the time. Let's see here. So focusing on the strengths. He emphasized critical thinking skills, using reason. And this is also something that was very uncommon at the time. Ellis would note that people had a tendency to engage in a lot of thought distortions or crappy thinking, so to speak. So he would sort these into categories like awfulizing, meaning taking something that might be something of a hassle and turning it into something that's awful. He would create categories like can't stand it-itis. You know, this tendency we very often have to say, it's awful, I just can't stand it. And he would help people to challenge these notions. Very importantly, and I think his most important contribution was to really emphasize going after people's musts, needs, and shoulds. That's the main thing that I picked up from Ellis. So if you listen to people, you'll notice that we have a tendency to engage in a lot of absolutistic thinking. And the typical absolutistic thinking is notions such as, I must succeed, I must perform, I must achieve the goals that I have, versus merely preferring it and doing one's best to achieve it. Uh, Instead of merely preferring that people respect us and appreciate us and love us, we have a tendency, many of us, to demand it, to think that we need approval and that we need to be loved. And when it comes to the world, instead of merely preferring justice and our communities to be a good place and to do what we can to contribute to it, we engage in a lot of masturbation and shoulding by absolutely demanding that the world and human nature be in a particular way. Anytime we do that, we suffer, and we suffer unnecessarily. So anytime I kind of demand that people be kinder, or that I be more competent than I actually am in the moment, or I demand that someone understand me or listen to me and they seem not to, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to suffer unnecessarily. So Ellis had a deep insight about this once as a young man, where I think it was a girlfriend who had broken up with him, and he took a midnight walk in New York, very depressed. And it suddenly dawned on him that the real source of his depression was him thinking and believing that he needed that particular girlfriend. The idea that he needed her and that she had to take him back when she didn't was actually the source of his misery. So Ellis became very skilled at identifying, helping clients discover how they were masturbating and needing and shoulding, helping the clients become aware of it and challenging it in often artistic, humorous, provocative ways. And I think Ellis did this better than anyone else I've encountered. And that's the main thing I've taken from Ellis. This is also one thing that REBT, Ellis's system, emphasizes strongly over CBT, Aaron Beck's system, is that Ellis has a tendency to way more go after the musts, the shoulds, and the needs. And as far as I'm concerned, that's usually where the real action is. Helping people identify it, see it, and helping them have insights about it in a embodied way. Other things too. So for example, if you look at our current culture, young teenagers and young people today are more depressed, more anxious, more suicides, more suicide attempts than they used to have in the past. And our current educational systems and emphasis on political correctness and identity politics is teaching young people to engage in many of the thought distortions that people like Ellis and Beck did their best to help their clients discover and challenge. So for example, one of them being emotional reasoning. So for example, let's say that you say something and I feel hurt. Emotional reasoning would be to take the feeling of hurt as evidence that means that you meant to hurt me, and therefore you're an awful person, for example. That's emotional reasoning. Or a lot of our young people today in this politically correct climate are trained to think in those ways by demanding safe spaces and trigger warnings and so on and so forth. And people like Ellis did a really good job in helping people challenge and dispute their emotional reasoning, their absolutism. Something else that he really emphasized was what he called unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional life acceptance. This is also something that separated him a bit from Beck and CBT. He did not try to help clients increase their self-esteem. Instead, he pointed out the madness of how, when people conceptualize self-esteem, they very often rate themselves globally as good or bad based upon their performance or based upon how other people approved of them. So Ellis instead did a very good job philosophically and through experiments to help people to not rate themselves globally, but just rate their behaviors and their ways of thinking in a particular concept. And he would emphasize that you can choose to accept yourself unconditionally as a person, irrespective of how well you perform or who seems to approve of you. And this has a tendency to radically reduce shame and anxiety and a lot of the neuroticism that people struggle with. He also acknowledged that what we call a self is more of a process, more an activity that we're kind of engaging in, and therefore is not fixed but malleable. And that also went into him helping clients to see that trying to improve ourselves or to rate ourselves has a tendency to result in a lot more neuroticism than we otherwise would have. So this was also a great contribution of Ellis. When I encountered Ellis's work, I never met the man, but I encountered his work in the early 2000s. And I would say around 2003, 2004, I really did a deep dive into it. I've read about 30 of his books, and I've done a lot of a lot of his stuff with myself and with clients since. It's one of the main influences. And the two things that I just mentioned, the unconditional self-acceptance and challenging absolutistic thinking, really helped me because I came from an NLP and hypnosis background where there was a lot of sloppy thinking and a lot of absolutistic claims going on. So for example, I remember one of the brochures for the NLP trainings I went to, it would say things like always gain rapport, have total state control, release all negative emotions. Like when you looked at it, there was a lot of this absolutistic thinking going on. And when I started helping my clients to challenge that absolutism and did the same with me, it really did a lot for my practice, for me personally, and for my clients. So let's see here. Yeah, so another big strength in Ellis's approach was, rational emotive behavior therapy. So as I said, he emphasized reason a lot. His approach was also at times very philosophical. And that's useful for a lot of people. So for people like me who are pretty philosophically inclined, that was very useful. He could task people by reading books. And if you look today at, for example, the Jordan Peterson phenomena, you see that a good book, a good lecture can really work wonders. A good philosophical discussion can really work wonders. He did a lot of, as I said, a lot of disputing work, with pen and paper. That's often very useful to look at your thoughts in a systematic way and to identify the thought distortions and to challenge them. But he didn't stop there. Emotive, he also had some techniques for using imagery to evoke emotion and to change it. I think he was a little weak in that area, which I'm going to go into when I start talking about what I think are some of the weaknesses. But he had some stuff there too. And also behavioral. As I said, he helped himself by forcing himself essentially to speak to women and to speak in public. So he was not shy to take clients out of the office and to put them in real life situations and help them develop practical skills, for example. Um, Ordeals, tasks, things to do in the world. He had his famous shame attacking exercises. So he might have someone, walk a banana on a leash, pretending it's a dog, or he might have people walk with an umbrella, on a day with sunshine, or he might have someone sit on a bus or train and to yell out loud the stop signs, as they approached, like socially cumbersome things as shame attacking exercises. He would do a lot of that type of stuff. He would use provocation. He would use swearing, colorful language to evoke emotion. Um, he would use humor. That was also a strength with Ellis. He had these wacky songs, that he would sing with clients and where he would make fun of things. Let's see what else we have here. Um, I would also say that one of the strengths in his entire mindset too was his honesty about mistakes. Ellis was not one of those people who pretended that every client was a success story. He was very straight about a lot of people not changing, people changing partially, people perhaps changing quite a bit, people changing a lot. And even in his books, he writes about this. So, for example, in one of his books, which is a good one called RABT, It Works for Me, It Can Work for You, he talks about instances in his own life where RABT has worked for him, but also instances in which RABT has not worked for him. And I think that honesty, that willingness to experiment, that willingness to admit to shortcomings, um, made his work very humane and made it easier for many people to connect with him. That there was a rawness and an honesty about him that was very, very appealing. And there was a complete lack of political correctness. He could be very confrontational, he could be very blunt, he would use colorful language, he would take no prisoners. And when you look at a lot of the therapy world, there's a lot of wimps, there's a lot of wussies, there's a lot of approval addicts and and politically correct people. Um, and in that respect, Ellis was a huge relief. And he was a fighter. He was a fighter that really championed and stood for the things that he actually stood for. So these are some of the strong points of Ellis's system. Now let's look at what I perceive to be some of the weaknesses of Ellis's system. In all fairness, so one of them, and this applies to pretty much everyone, he accepted the idea of mental illness, and he did not do a good job in making a distinction between a literal medical diagnosis and a metaphorical mental illness diagnosis. And I think that his work would have been way more effective, at least that's been my experience, if he had not used the illness therapy framework, but instead would have used a more educational one. Um, if you're really interested in this, there's a great debate that you can buy on DVD called the Ellis Zas Debate. It was held in 1968, I think, in New York. It was a debate between Thomas Szasz, who's one of my favorite thinkers, and Albert Ellis about whether mental illness exists or not. And I think Thomas Szasz really kicks his ass in that debate. And I'd highly, it's kind of expensive, but I really, it's a great debate. So I would say that's a weakness. Um, Another weakness is there's nothing about breathing or ways to use your physiology. So one thing I've discovered over time is that helping clients to breathe properly can really work wonders. And I've read about 30 of his books. I've never seen anything about good breathing as a behavioral intervention in any of Ellis's work. There's also really nothing about, let's call it physiological hacks. So sometimes one weakness of REBT and also CBT is that it can become a bit too intellectual and not embodied enough. And I remember working with a woman who had a phobia around other people puking and sickness. And I tried to do a lot of this type of stuff, and we just really didn't get anywhere. It was very difficult. And then one day in my office, I turned the computer on and I had her watch videos of people puking on YouTube, and she was almost puking. She was terrified. And then I had her take a tennis ball and kind of throw it back and forth over the midline to get her hemispheres to really coordinate and to work together. And the whole thing just dissolved. It was like a big collapse anchor, and that was it. She's been pretty much fine ever since. Now, of course, that doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. There's a lot of simple things like that you can use using physiology. I remember another client I had once with a fear of heights who I just thought how to do peripheral vision, and that alone solved it. I've done that also with a lot of people for public speaking anxieties. Teach them how to do peripheral vision when they're in front of an audience. So there's a lot of what you could call physiological hacks, things you can do with movement and breathing that seems completely absent from Ellis's thinking and his system. Another big weakness, I would say, is that he seemed to completely dismiss meditation. He would teach people, some progressive relaxation but when he was asked, do you meditate? He would say, no, I'm not fucking neurotic, so I don't have to. But he really dismissed meditation and did not get how meditation can really help people. So for example, with a good meditation practice, you can help people really discover that pain and suffering are two quite distinct things. That even with pain, suffering is largely optional. You can help people discover that their sense of a stable, solid self is a thought-created illusion, for example. You can help people to discover these things in a very embodied way. Today, when you look at methodologies like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is like if behaviorism was a first generation CBT or REBT, and then Ellis and Beck was like second generation, today with metacognitive therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy is like of a third wave. You see a lot more of a mindfulness practices and meditation practices, learning to observe thoughts, learning to relate to emotions in a better way, learning to not attach a self to everything that happens. There's a lot of stuff there that Ellis seemed to completely miss. So I think that's a big weak spot in Ellis's system. What else do we have here? Yeah, so as I said, with meditation too, if you look at people like Byron Katie or the three principles or my own psychological illusion model, what I've discovered over time is that you often get way more bang for the buck by helping people to discover that their experience is made of thought, is a thought. Um, Ellis didn't really that much have that. It was more about changing the thinking and disputing the thinking and learning to think better and more rationally. And there's a lot of value in that. But there's also a lot of value in helping people see the illusory nature of thought to begin with. It's a bit like the analogy I've used in many videos about film. You know, once you discover the nature of film, how it all is an illusion, it never occurs to you to try to change the film or to control the film. If anything ever gets too intense, all you have to do is to lean back and kind of connect with the understanding that all you're really seeing is a screen. So there's a lot of stuff there that Ellis seemed to completely miss. Also, a lot of Ellis's interventions largely used reason and internal dialogue. I never saw him do many of the typical things that you do in neurolinguistic programming or NLP. For example, helping people discover that if they're associated with a memory, for example, they have a tendency to have the feelings, but if they step out of the images and watch themselves from a distance, that can really change their emotional response. Helping people not necessarily just change what they think, but perhaps notice the location of the internal dialogue and the voice and the rhythm, and to play around like a sound technician with the submodalities. These are very typical NLP-ish things that there's what I've discovered by combining these things over time is that there's quite a few people who might not necessarily resonate with the REBT stuff, who really do resonate if you move them in a more NLP-ish direction, and also the opposite. So they complement each other so well. And it's really sad to see a guy like Ellis write that many books and to never implement any of that sort of stuff in his work. There's a lot you can say about NLP, but there are some basic skills there that are great. The meta model, for example, or learning to set a resource anchor, learning to collapse an anchor, for example. Playing with some modalities to help people not only change how they think, but also discover the illusory nature of thought as well. So Ellis could have really improved, I think, his system by implementing some of that stuff. He did, to his credit, dabble a little bit in hypnosis, but he didn't really seem to go into it at any level of depth. So very little emphasis on suggestion artistry. Of course, I forgot to mention one thing. One big strength of REBT is that you can self-apply. Yes, you can self-apply some of the NLP stuff too, but it's a lot more difficult for most people. REBT is way more self-sufficient in a sense, which I think is a big strength. What else? Yeah, so I remember many years ago, I had a talk with a psychology student who said, this is probably 15 years ago, who said, yeah, you NLP hypnosis guys, we have all this stuff in psychology. We have CBT, we have Ellis, for example, we have REBT. What do you guys bring to the table that Ellis didn't? I said, you're largely right. And let me ask you this. When's the last time you heard about Ellis or any of his students helped someone resolve an allergic response? And of course, his answer was never. And I think this is also a weakness in his system, or something he really didn't seem to explore, is how you can use, call it mind-body work or psychological, in quotation marks, stuff in terms of chronic pain, migraines, allergies, asthma, these sorts of things. I from the about 30 books I've read from Ellis, I've really done a deep dive into it. I can't say I've really seen any of that at all. So that also, I think, is a weakness. Now, as a final thing, a little look at Ellis, the person himself. As I said, he had a lot of good qualities. He was a fantastic psychologist in many ways. He was a moral relativist. And I remember once reading an interview in Psychology Today. This might be 20 years ago or something, where he was asked, "Do you have any kids?" And his answer was, "None to speak of." And I just found that to be a fascinating response. It just kind of stuck in my mind. And then I read his autobiography. And what I want to tell you now sounds crazy, but it's here. It's in Albert Ellis All Out, his autobiography. Um, so one thing that Ellis, and kudos to Ellis for discussing his own moral failings, although he's kind of dubious as to whether it really was a moral failing. But he doesn't hold anything back. So here's what happened. He had an ex who remarried with a guy, and the first child that she had with the husband seemed a bit mentally slow. Now, he turned out to be okay as the years progressed, but she had a suspicion that this was her husband's genetics that seemed to make her son a bit slow. And she wanted a second child, but she had this idea that Albert Ellis had these great genes and he wanted him to be the father. So she went to Albert Ellis and proposed that he father her child in secret. And Ellis agreed to this. And you can read the details on just how devious they are and how deceptive they are in doing this. But Ellis, well, he essentially says, look, I thought that I had good genes and that I thought, that I should bring those into the world, but he didn't really want any parental responsibilities, and he was helping her, and he got a lot of great sex, as he said. So he fathered the child. He was having sex with his ex, and they deceived her husband to think that it was his child. This didn't happen once. This happened with 3 children. So Ellis fathered 3 kids with his ex, and his ex lied to her husband about these being the kids, his kids, essentially. And Ellis was in on the scheme. And I remember reading that and thinking, what a creep. Like what a deceptive, lying creep. It sounds almost psychopathic to me to be that negligent with your own kids. He never did anything to take accountability for them. His ex kind of revealed the truth of it after her husband died to the kids, but Ellis doesn't really have a connection to the kids. I mean, he's dead now. He never did anything to help them, and he deceived the wife of his or the husband of his ex-girlfriend, or was it ex-wife? I'm not quite sure. So I think this shows some serious moral shortcomings in Ellis. Now, those are, of course, my opinions. So some people will disagree. I think there's many things you can take from that. I mean, kudos to him for writing about it and being honest about it, even though he doesn't seem to have any remorse about it, really. One lesson you could draw from it is that human beings are a really mixed bag. That people, as he said, he could still unconditionally accept himself even with his moral failings, and that's a good point. Don't put people up on a pedestal. If you look into anyone's life, you'll probably find things that are far from good in most instances. I think one kind of empowering thing that can come from realizing something like that about a guy like Ellis is that a lot of people probably think that they have to be perfect, flawless human beings to do good client work. And Ellis clearly shows that you don't necessarily have to be that at all, that he's very, very human. So knowing that might make Ellis in their eyes and the work and themselves, more humane in a sense. So I thought that was interesting. As I said, I highly recommend looking into his work. I didn't find his autobiography, I mean, it is a big book, that good. There's way too much in there about his sex life for some reason that I didn't find too intriguing. His two bestsellers are A Guide to Rational Living. This is a very, very good book. I highly recommend this one. Another one is called How to Stubbornly Refuse to Make Yourself Miserable About Anything. Yes, anything. This is also a good practical book. So these are probably the two main recommendations. I also really like this one. Just a very simple, How to Make Yourself Happy. It's a short book. Shameless plug. I also wrote a book called Provocative Suggestions that to a large extent integrates NLP and hypnosis with REBT type philosophy. I don't know of any other book that does that on the market. It also combines state-based interventions like you see in NLP within a adult developmental psychology framework. So I'm very happy with that book. I think it's a very good contribution. So anyways, I'd love to hear your feedback on this video, whether you agree, disagree, what you agree with, any comments that you might have. As always, I'm available for mentoring, for seminars, and for change work. If you like my ideas and you'd like to work with me, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.